You think you know Humpty Dumpty? A clumsy egg perched on a garden wall, tumbling to his demise in a moment of foolishness. A harmless nursery rhyme recited in kindergartens, illustrated with cheerful watercolors of a rotund character with stick arms and a bow tie. But what if I told you that Humpty Dumpty was never an egg at all? What if the Great Fall wasn't an accident, but a violent military catastrophe that changed the course of English history? What if the king's horses and the king's men weren't helpers in a fairy tale, but actual soldiers watching their defensive position crumble into irreparable ruin? Because buried beneath this sanitized children's verse lies something far more disturbing. A coded record of siege warfare, political assassination, and the terrifying moment when an entire army realized that some things, once shattered, can never be restored. The rhyme you learned as a child wasn't written to amuse you. It was written to mock the defeated, to warn against hubris, and to teach a brutal lesson about the finality of destruction. Once you understand what really sat on that wall, once you learn why it fell and who watched it break, you'll never hear this nursery rhyme the same way again. Welcome back. Let's uncover the truth. The year is 1648. England tears itself apart in civil war. Brother fights brother, neighbor denounces neighbor, and the ancient structures of feudal loyalty collapse into ideological violence. In the coastal town of Colchester, royalist forces loyal to King Charles I have barricaded themselves behind medieval walls, preparing for a siege that will become one of the bloodiest confrontations of the entire war. The parliamentarian army under Lord Fairfax surrounds the city, cutting off supplies, bombarding the defenses, waiting for starvation to do what cannon fire cannot. But the royalists have one advantage: a massive piece of artillery positioned atop the church tower of St. Mary at the walls, commanding a devastating field of fire over the besiegers below. This weapon wasn't a standard field gun. According to military records and local tradition, it was likely a saka, a heavy bronze cannon weighing over 2,000 pounds, or possibly an even larger siege mortar capable of hurling explosive shells in high arcs over enemy fortifications. The gun's colloquial nickname among the defenders was Humpty Dumpty. The name itself carried connotations that 17th century soldiers would have immediately recognized: something top-heavy, ungainly, precariously balanced. The term already existed in vulgar slang to describe both a potent alcoholic drink and a person of awkward, humped stature. Applied to a cannon perched impossibly high on a church belfry never designed to bear such weight, the nickname was both apt and ominous. The strategic genius of this placement was matched only by its inherent instability. Medieval church towers were constructed to support bells, not artillery. The constant recoil from firing sessions sent shock waves through ancient masonry, cracking mortar, loosening stones. But for weeks, the gambit worked. The royalist gunners, reportedly led by a one-eyed artillerist named Jack Thompson, rained destruction on the parliamentarian positions. Every shot from Humpty Dumpty forced the besiegers to recalculate their assault plans, to pull back their forward positions, to accept higher casualties. The cannon became a symbol of royalist defiance, proof that even surrounded and starving, the king's forces could still hurt their enemies. But the parliamentarians understood what every military engineer knows: the higher the position, the more fragile the foundation. They concentrated their counter-battery fire not on the cannon itself, but on the wall beneath it, systematically targeting the structural supports of the belfry. Day after day, cannonballs slammed into the base of the tower. Stones cracked, timber supports splintered, and then, in July 1648, the wall gave way. Humpty Dumpty plummeted 30 feet to the cobblestones below, shattering into fragments of twisted bronze and iron. The impact was catastrophic. The barrels split, the carriage disintegrated. The massive weapon that had held the parliamentarians at bay was reduced to scrap metal scattered across the churchyard. And here's where the rhyme becomes grimly literal. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. This wasn't poetic exaggeration. It was battlefield reality. A shattered cannon of that magnitude required a foundry, specialized craftsmen, weeks of labor, resources that simply didn't exist within the besieged walls of Colchester. The draft horses mentioned in the rhyme, the animals used to haul heavy artillery, were useless. The soldiers who might have repaired smaller equipment were helpless. The fall of Humpty Dumpty marked the beginning of the end for the royalist defense. Within weeks, starvation forced surrender. The city fell, the garrison was executed or scattered, and the story of a cannon that couldn't be fixed became a piece of parliamentarian propaganda, a mocking verse that celebrated the limits of royal power. To understand why Humpty Dumpty's fall was so devastating, you need to grasp the physics of 17th century siege warfare. City walls weren't just barriers. They were psychological statements of permanence and power. The ability to position artillery above the enemy transformed static defense into active threat. But this tactical advantage came with an inherent contradiction. The higher you placed your weapons, the more precarious their position became. Medieval architecture was never designed for the violent recoil forces of gunpowder artillery. Church towers, in particular, were engineered for vertical load, not horizontal shock. The belfry of St. Mary at the walls was a 13th century structure, built when the deadliest projectile was an arrow or a thrown stone. Its walls were thick, yes, but their strength derived from compression, from the weight of stone pressing downward. When royalist engineers hauled a multi-ton cannon up those spiral stairs and positioned it on a wooden platform near the top, they were asking the architecture to perform a function it was never meant to sustain. Every time the gunners lit the fuse, the explosion sent recoil forces backward through the carriage, into the platform, into the stone walls themselves. Ancient mortar, already weakened by century of weather and settling, began to fail. The parliamentarians didn't need to destroy the tower outright. They just needed to accelerate the inevitable. Their counter-battery strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Target the base, create vibrations, let gravity and structural fatigue do the rest. Historical accounts describe a final barrage that lasted hours. Dozens of cannonballs slamming into the tower's foundation until the masonry simply surrendered. When the wall collapsed, it took Humpty Dumpty with it, and the psychological impact rippled through the entire garrison. The defenders had placed their faith, quite literally, in a position that defied the laws of engineering. When it failed, it wasn't just a weapon that fell, it was their entire strategic doctrine. This is where the nursery rhyme gains its coded power. To say that Humpty Dumpty had a great fall is to minimize a catastrophic structural failure that killed the soldiers manning the gun, destroyed the city's primary defensive asset, and shattered morale throughout the royalist ranks. To say that all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again is to mock the very concept of royal authority. If the king's vast resources, his cavalry, his infantry, his engineers all proved powerless before the simple physics of a falling cannon, then what claim could the monarchy make to divine right or earthly competence? The rhyme doesn't just describe a military defeat. It performs a cultural execution, reducing royal power to a pile of broken metal that not even God's anointed could repair. The sanitization of this story into a tale about an egg was a brilliant act of historical erasure. By the 19th century, when the rhyme was standardized in children's books, the English Civil War had been thoroughly mythologized, its violence domesticated into patriotic narrative. But the core logic of irreversibility remained. An egg, like a cannon, like a king, cannot be unmade and remade. Once the shell breaks, once the structure fails, once the sovereign falls, no amount of intervention can restore what was. The rhyme survived not despite its darkness, but because that darkness was encoded in a form that seemed harmless enough to recite to children. But there's another interpretation of Humpty Dumpty that shifts the story from mechanical failure to human tragedy. Multiple folklorists have identified the rhyme as a coded allegory for the fall of King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. This reading transforms the narrative from military propaganda into political satire, a mocking epitaph for the last Plantagenet king written by the victorious Tudors who needed to justify their seizure of the throne. Richard III was physically caricatured by Tudor historians as a hunchback, a deformed creature whose twisted body reflected his twisted soul. Shakespeare immortalized this image, giving us a Richard who creeps across the stage, one shoulder higher than the other, a visible manifestation of moral corruption. The nickname Humpty Dumpty, with its connotations of physical awkwardness and top-heaviness, fits this propaganda perfectly. To call Richard Humpty was to reduce a king to a figure of ridicule, something misshapen and ungainly, doomed to fall. The wall in this interpretation becomes more complex. Some theories suggest it refers to the defensive wall Richard occupied during the battle, a literal high ground position he abandoned in his final desperate charge toward Henry Tudor. Other interpretations are more metaphorical. The wall represents the social hierarchy itself, the elevated position of kingship from which Richard fell when his army collapsed and his allies deserted. The most intriguing theory connects the wall to Richard's horse, which some accounts claim was nicknamed Wall for its stubborn, immovable temperament. Tudor propaganda famously includes Richard's cry, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," suggesting that his mount failed him at the critical moment. If the horse was called Wall and Richard fell from it, then the rhyme becomes almost painfully literal. What happened next is documented with brutal clarity. Richard was unhorsed during his charge, surrounded by enemy soldiers and beaten to death with bladed weapons. His body was stripped naked, slung over a horse, and paraded through Leicester. Later examinations of his skeleton, discovered beneath a parking lot in 2012, show massive trauma to the skull, 9 separate wounds, 2 of which would have been instantly fatal. The back of his skull was sheared off, likely by a halberd blow delivered after he was already down. His face was mutilated. His spine showed the curvature that Tudor propagandists had exaggerated into monstrous deformity. This was a body that had been broken with deliberate savagery, a message written in bone and blood. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Richard's supporters were either killed or fled. His body was buried in an unmarked grave by monks who feared even in death the power of association with a failed king. For over 500 years, no one knew exactly where he lay. The failure to put him together was both literal and political. The Tudors couldn't allow Richard to be properly interred, properly mourned, properly remembered. They needed him shattered, unmourned. A cautionary tale about the dangers of seizing power without divine sanction. The nursery rhyme ensured that even children would learn the lesson. Kings can fall, and when they do, no one can save them. This interpretation layers the rhyme with multiple meanings. It's simultaneously about a specific historical figure and a universal warning about the fragility of authority. It suggests that physical deformity marks moral failure, a disturbing bit of ableism that medieval audiences would have accepted without question. And it demonstrates how political violence can be encoded into children's verses, passed down through generations who have no idea they're reciting a mocking epitaph for a murdered king. To fully understand the disturbing origins of Humpty Dumpty, we need to examine the linguistic landscape of 17th and 18th century England. Because Humpty Dumpty existed as a phrase long before it became attached to this specific rhyme, and its meanings were far removed from anything resembling childhood innocence. According to the 1785 edition of a classical dictionary of the vulgar tongue, a Humpty Dumpty was a specific type of alcoholic beverage, ale boiled with brandy. This wasn't a casual drink. It was a potent, disorienting concoction consumed by people seeking oblivion, the kind of drink that led to what the era euphemistically called Great Falls. Tavern keepers knew that customers who ordered a Humpty Dumpty were likely to end the evening unconscious, potentially injured, certainly in no condition to be put together by any concerned bystander. The phrase carried connotations of self-destruction, of willful descent into a state from which recovery was uncertain. Simultaneously, Humpty Dumpty served as a cruel nickname for people with physical disabilities, particularly those with spinal deformities or hunched postures. Historical records from the early 18th century document its use as an insult in satirical poems and street ballads. A 1701 poem titled "A Rod for Tunbridge Bows" mocks a man of title whose physical stature doesn't match his social pretensions, calling him a Humpty Dumpty who has climbed too high above his natural station. The implication is clear. Certain bodies don't belong on metaphorical walls, and when they climb there anyway, their fall is both inevitable and deserved. This creates a deeply unsettling third interpretation of the rhyme. What if Humpty Dumpty wasn't a canon or a king, but an ordinary person, disabled or intoxicated or both, who fell from a high place and died? What if the wall was a literal wall, a bridge, a staircase, and the Great Fall was a fatal accident? 17th century England had no safety regulations, no medical trauma care, no social services for the disabled or addicted. A person who fell from a significant height while drunk or physically impaired would likely die, and the king's men, whether interpreted as watchmen, doctors, or simply bystanders, would be powerless to reverse the damage. The rhyme in this reading becomes a piece of dark social commentary, a warning about the consequences of vice or the dangers faced by those whose bodies don't conform to expectations of balance and stability. It mocks both the fallen individual and the authorities who failed to prevent the fall or repair its consequences. The laugh, if there is one, is bitter and cruel. The kind of humor that emerges when a society has normalized preventable deaths and decided they're either deserved or inevitable. What makes this interpretation particularly disturbing is how it intersects with the other meanings. Whether Humpty was a canon, a king, or a drunk with a spinal deformity, the core message remains the same. Some falls are final. Some damage cannot be undone. Some people, some weapons, some political systems, once broken, will never be whole again. The rhyme teaches children to accept this as natural law, to internalize the idea that irreversibility is built into the fabric of existence, and that even unlimited resources, all the king's horses and all the king's men, cannot overcome the basic physics of destruction. Before Humpty Dumpty became a character in children's books, it existed as a riddle. This is perhaps the most widely accepted origin theory among folklorists, and it reveals a pedagogical purpose far darker than modern education would permit. The riddle rhyme was posed to children with the expectation that they would deduce the answer based on the clues provided. Something that sits, something that falls, something that cannot be repaired. The answer, of course, was an egg. But this wasn't a playful guessing game. It was a lesson in mortality. 17th century childhood was saturated with death. Infant mortality rates exceeded 40% in some regions. Children watched siblings die of diseases we now prevent with vaccines. They saw bodies in the streets during plague years. They understood, in ways modern Western children are shielded from, that life was fragile and often short. The Humpty Dumpty riddle taught them to think about irreversibility, about the difference between things that can be fixed and things that cannot. The pedagogical genius lies in what the riddle omits. It doesn't tell you Humpty is an egg. It forces you to work backward from the impossible task of repair. Why can't the king's men put Humpty together? Because certain structures, once compromised, lose their essential integrity. An egg's shell isn't just a container. It's an architectural marvel of compression strength that completely fails under tensile stress. Once fractured, the yolk and white spill out, mix with dirt, begin to decompose. No amount of careful reassembly can restore the original state. The egg becomes other things: a stain, a smell, food for insects, but never again an egg. This is existential education disguised as a children's game. The riddle prepares young minds for a world where head injuries often proved fatal, where falling from heights meant death or permanent disability, where medical intervention was primitive and often counterproductive. The 40 doctors mentioned in an 1842 variant of the rhyme couldn't help either. This edition makes the lesson even more explicit. Professional expertise has limits. Even if you gather every physician in the kingdom, some damage exceeds their capacity to heal. The historical context makes this pedagogy even more chilling. In an era before antibiotics, before surgical anesthesia, before germ theory, a significant fall could easily lead to infection, sepsis, death. Children needed to understand that certain risks were absolute. The rhyme encoded this knowledge in memorable form, using the logic of the riddle to make the lesson stick. You remember the answer to a riddle. You remember that some things cannot be fixed. And if you're a child in 17th century England, that memory might save your life by teaching you caution. But there's a darker edge to this pedagogical strategy. By teaching children to accept irreversibility, the rhyme also teaches them to accept failure. It normalizes the idea that some problems have no solutions, that some situations are beyond help, that sometimes the king himself, with all his resources, is powerless. This is useful knowledge in a hierarchical society where most people will spend their lives serving masters who cannot or will not protect them. The rhyme prepares children for a world of limited options, where the best you can hope for is to avoid being the one on the wall, and if you do end up there, to understand that your fall will be your own responsibility, with no rescue coming from above. In the modern era, Humpty Dumpty has been appropriated by scientists as a metaphor for systems that cannot be reversed. And this scientific adoption reveals how deeply the rhyme's logic resonates with fundamental laws of physics and biology. The Humpty Dumpty problem appears across multiple disciplines, each time illustrating the terrifying truth that the rhyme encoded centuries before thermodynamics became a formal science. In physics, Humpty Dumpty illustrates the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy always increases in a closed system. When the egg falls and breaks, energy disperses. The organized structure of shell, membrane, white, and yolk becomes disorganized. The pieces scatter. The yolk mixes with dirt. Bacteria begin breaking down proteins. Each of these processes represents an increase in entropy, a movement toward disorder that is statistically irreversible. Yes, the energy to reconstitute the egg still exists in the universe, but the probability of all those molecules spontaneously reassembling in the correct configuration is effectively zero. This is the arrow of time made visible. You can't unbreak an egg, you can't unmix a solution, you can't reverse the flow from order to chaos. The metaphor extends to cosmology. The universe itself is winding down, moving from complex organized structures toward heat death, a state of maximum entropy where no usable energy remains. Every star that burns out, every black hole that evaporates, every chemical reaction that reaches equilibrium, these are all variations of Humpty Dumpty falling from the wall. The cosmos cannot be put back together. The ultimate fate of everything is dispersion, dissolution, the end of structure and meaning. The nursery rhyme you learned as a child encodes the heat death of the universe. In developmental psychology, the Humpty Dumpty problem describes a different kind of irreversibility. Dr. Lisa Oakes and her colleagues use the metaphor to critique reductionist approaches to studying infant cognition. By breaking the developing mind into isolated components, memory here, perception there, attention somewhere else, researchers were shattering their understanding of the whole child. Like the king's men examining pieces of broken egg, scientists could identify every fragment but couldn't explain how they functioned as an integrated system. The metaphor warned that some forms of analysis destroy the very thing they attempt to understand. You can't put the infant back together again once you've dissected cognition into artificially separated pieces. This psychological application carries disturbing implications. If the act of studying something can fundamentally alter or destroy it, Then what are we doing when we subject children to batteries of cognitive tests, when we diagnose and categorize and label? Are we understanding them, or are we breaking them into fragments that we then claim we cannot reassemble? The Humpty Dumpty problem suggests that certain forms of knowledge come at the cost of wholeness, that to analyze is sometimes to destroy, and that the limitations of the king's men might apply not just to medieval soldiers, but to modern scientists convinced that enough data and enough expertise can solve any problem. The rhyme has even entered medical literature. A 2015 paper in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease asked whether researchers should focus on preventing neurodegeneration or attempting to repair damage after it occurs. The title posed the question directly: do we try mending Humpty Dumpty or prevent his fall? The answer, supported by decades of failed attempts to reverse dementia, was clear. Prevention is the only viable strategy because once neurons die, once neural networks degrade, once the brain's structure collapses past a certain point, no intervention can restore function. All the king's horses and all the king's men, reimagined as neurologists and pharmaceutical companies, cannot put together a brain that has fallen into advanced Alzheimer's disease. The resonance of Humpty Dumpty extends far beyond England. Across Europe, variations of the rhyme appear in multiple languages, each one preserving the core logic of irreparable fall. These variants suggest that the fear encoded in Humpty Dumpty isn't culturally specific but universal, a fundamental human anxiety about the fragility of structure and the finality of collapse. In Germany, children learn about Runzelchen Ponzelchen, a character whose name mimics the phonetic rhythm of Humpty Dumpty. The German version emphasizes the failure of rights, a word that means both repair and legal justice, suggesting that neither technical intervention nor social order can undo certain kinds of damage. In France, Bulbul focuses on the spherical shape and the physics of impact, treating the fall as an inevitable consequence of geometry rather than misfortune. Swedish and Norwegian children encounter Lille Trill, a direct parallel to Humpty that maintains the riddle structure: something small, something round, something that breaks. The Swiss variant, Anebadadeli, is particularly interesting because it treats the fall as a dance of death, a rhythmic, almost choreographed movement toward destruction. This connects the rhyme to the medieval danse macabre tradition, where death comes for all regardless of status, and no amount of wealth or power can prevent the final leveling. The rhythmic quality of Anebadadeli makes the fall feel not like an accident, but like destiny, a predetermined movement that carries the same inevitability as music reaching its final note. These variations suggest several possibilities. One is that the rhyme descends from an ancient Proto-Indo-European story, possibly a solar myth, where the sun, round, high, powerful, falls into the underworld each night and cannot be restored to the sky in the same form twice. This interpretation would make Humpty Dumpty one of the oldest surviving narratives in Western culture, a remnant of pagan cosmology that survived Christianization by disguising itself as a children's game. Another possibility is convergent cultural evolution. Across different societies, people developed similar metaphors for irreversibility because they were grappling with the same fundamental realities. Falling is dangerous. Breaking is often permanent. Authority has limits. The egg works as a symbol in every culture that keeps chickens, which is to say, virtually every culture. The lesson doesn't need to be imported. It emerges naturally from observing what happens when fragile things fall. What's striking is how consistently these variants maintain the element of failed rescue. In every version, someone or something tries to help and fails. The king's men, the townspeople, the magical creatures, none can reverse the damage. This consistency suggests that the lesson being taught isn't just about individual fragility, but about collective helplessness. Communities, governments, authorities, they all have limits. There are problems they cannot solve, injuries they cannot heal, losses they cannot prevent. The rhyme teaches children to lower their expectations of institutional protection, to understand that sometimes you fall, and when you do, you're on your own. This is a devastating piece of social education, and it appears in culture after culture, suggesting that it serves a crucial function. Perhaps by teaching children early that rescue is not guaranteed, societies prepare them for adult realities of limited resources, failed systems, and the necessity of self-reliance. Or perhaps, more cynically, the rhyme serves to inoculate populations against demanding too much from their rulers. If even the king cannot put Humpty together again, then what right do you have to expect the king to solve your problems? The transformation of Humpty Dumpty from a multivalent symbol of destruction into a literal anthropomorphic egg was completed by Lewis Carroll in 1871 with the publication of Through the Looking Glass. Carroll's Humpty Dumpty is one of the most memorable characters in Victorian children's literature. A pompous pedant perched on a wall, lecturing Alice about the nature of language and meaning. He's on birthday parties and portmanteau words, and the declaration that when he uses a word, it means precisely what he chooses it to mean. But even in Carroll's sanitized version, darkness persists. Humpty falls and presumably dies, though Carroll's narrative cuts away before the consequences. The character's pedantry about language, his insistence that he can control meaning through sheer force of will, becomes tragically ironic when the wall gives way and his linguistic philosophy proves useless against gravity. Carroll's Humpty is undone by the gap between intellectual mastery and physical vulnerability, a theme that resonates with Victorian anxieties about the limits of rational control in an increasingly industrialized and unpredictable world. Carroll's illustration, or rather John Tenniel's iconic drawings, fixed Humpty as an egg in the popular imagination. Prior to this, illustrations varied wildly. Some depicted him as a man, others as an abstract shape. Still others simply illustrated the broken aftermath without showing the character at all. Tenniel's egg, with a face, wearing a cravat, sitting smugly on a narrow wall, became definitive. This visual standardization completed the process of historical erasure. Children who learned the rhyme through Carroll's book had no idea they were encountering a story about siege warfare, political murder, or the death of drunks. They saw an egg, heard a lesson about being careful, and internalized the sanitized version. Yet the Victorian era didn't fully suppress Humpty's darkness. 19th century pantomimes frequently featured Humpty Dumpty as a chaotic trickster figure, a clown who engaged in theft, kidnapping, and violence before meeting a gruesome end. In these theatrical productions, Humpty was often swallowed by a whale, beaten by angry mobs, or dismembered by villains. The character served as an outlet for anarchic energy, a figure who challenged social order and paid for it with destruction. Even when reimagined for the stage, Humpty couldn't escape his association with irreversible violence. This tension between sanitization and persistent darkness reveals something crucial about cultural memory. You can soften a story, you can add cute illustrations, you can recontextualize a piece of violent propaganda as innocent entertainment, but you cannot fully erase the structural logic that made the story powerful in the first place. The reason Humpty Dumpty survived centuries of cultural change is precisely because it encodes a truth that remains relevant across historical periods. Some things, once broken, stay broken. The Victorian emphasis on decorum, on protecting children from harsh realities, required them to change Humpty into an egg. But the egg still falls, still breaks, and still cannot be repaired. The core message survives every attempt to soften it. Carroll himself understood this. His Humpty Dumpty is pompous, arrogant, sitting on a wall that's clearly too narrow for safety. The character's confidence in his own intellectual superiority makes his fall feel inevitable, even deserved. This is the Victorian morality tale. Pride comes before destruction, but it's also a continuation of the original political satire. Whether Humpty is a cannon that shouldn't have been placed so high, a king who overestimated his security, or an eggman who thinks he controls language and fate, the result is the same. The fall comes, the breaking happens, and no amount of cleverness, force, or royal intervention can reverse it. The question that haunts any analysis of Humpty Dumpty is why this particular rhyme has survived for centuries, while countless other nursery verses have been forgotten. The answer lies in what it teaches and how it teaches it. Humpty Dumpty is pedagogically efficient. It delivers a complex lesson about irreversibility, mortality, and institutional limits in 44 words that rhyme and scan perfectly. Children remember it not because it's pleasant, but because its logic is undeniable. The rhyme operates on multiple registers simultaneously. For small children, it's a puzzle to solve. What sits on a wall and breaks when it falls? For older children who already know the answer, it becomes a lesson about cause and effect. Sitting in high places is dangerous. For adults aware of the historical context, it's political commentary, military history, and social satire compressed into a few lines. This multiplicity of meaning makes the rhyme endlessly reusable across different age groups and educational contexts. But the deeper reason for its survival is the universality of its warning. Every generation needs to learn that some damage is permanent. In the 17th century, that meant understanding that fallen kings don't rise again and destroyed weapons cannot be rebuilt on a battlefield. In the Victorian era, it meant accepting that industrial accidents often killed workers whose families received no compensation. In the 20th century, it meant recognizing that nuclear weapons, once used, could not unmake their devastation. In the 21st century, it means confronting climate change, species extinction, and the irreversible consequences of ecological destruction. All the king's horses and all the king's men, reimagined as international treaties and technological interventions, cannot put together an earth we've shattered through centuries of extraction and pollution. The rhyme also teaches children to accept failure at the systemic level. It's not just that Humpty can't be fixed. It's that even unlimited resources applied by the most powerful authorities cannot fix him. This is a lesson in the limits of power, and it's a lesson that serves the interests of existing power structures. If you teach children early that even kings are helpless before certain problems, you're teaching them not to expect too much from government, not to demand the impossible, not to believe that collective action can solve fundamentally irreversible problems. This is conservative pedagogy disguised as common sense. Yet there's also something deeply honest in the rhyme's refusal to offer false hope. Some things cannot be fixed. Some falls are fatal, some moments of inattention, some structural failures, some acts of violence. They change the state of the world in ways that cannot be reversed by wishing, working, or even bleeding for a better outcome. The rhyme doesn't lie to children. It tells them the truth, and it trusts them to handle it. This is perhaps why the rhyme still unsettles us. We want to protect children from harsh realities. We want to believe that with enough effort, enough resources, enough love, any problem can be solved, any damage undone. Humpty Dumpty says no. Some eggs break, some walls collapse, some cannons shatter, some kings die, and when they do, they're gone. The finality of that message clashes with our cultural narratives of resilience and redemption. We tell stories where the hero falls and rises stronger. Humpty tells a story where falling is the end, full stop, and no amount of heroism changes that outcome. In the end, the disturbing mystery of Humpty Dumpty isn't really about a cannon, a king, a drunk, or an egg. It's about the wall itself, the precarious position that defines the human condition. We all sit on walls metaphorically. Walls of health that collapse into illness, walls of security that crumble into poverty, walls of relationship that fracture under stress, walls of certainty that give way to chaos. We spend our lives trying to maintain our balance, knowing that the fall, when it comes, might be permanent. The rhyme survives because it names this universal anxiety. It gives children language for the fear that underlies all human striving, the fear of irreversible loss. And it does so without offering false comfort. It doesn't promise that if you're careful, you won't fall. It doesn't suggest that if you fall, someone will catch you. It simply states the logic of entropy. Things fall, things break, and broken things often stay broken. This is why sanitizing the rhyme by turning it into a story about a clumsy egg never fully worked. The egg still falls, the egg still breaks. And no matter how cute the illustrations, no matter how cheerful the narrator's voice, the message remains. Some damage is beyond repair. Victorian parents wanted to shield their children from knowledge of siege warfare and political assassination, so they gave them an egg. But the egg taught the same lesson the cannon did, because the lesson isn't about what falls, it's about what happens after. The historical layers, the cannon and the king and the drunk, these aren't separate meanings competing for authenticity. They're all true simultaneously. Humpty Dumpty is a weapon that shouldn't have been placed so high, a ruler who overestimated his security, a person whose body or behavior made them vulnerable, and yes, an egg. The beauty of the rhyme is that it accommodates all these interpretations without choosing between them. It's a story about everything that sits precariously and then falls irreversibly, which is to say, it's a story about everything. When you teach this rhyme to a child today, you're participating in a tradition that stretches back through Victorian prudery, through Enlightenment rationalism, through Restoration comedy, through Civil War propaganda, possibly back to medieval allegory or even pre-Christian myth. You're handing down a piece of cultural knowledge that has survived because it encodes a truth humans need to learn. The universe trends toward disorder, power has limits, and some falls mark the end of something that will never exist again in the same form. Humpty Dumpty isn't a bedtime story. It's a briefing on mortality, dressed in nursery rhyme rhythms so that it can slip past our defenses and settle into memory, where it waits for the moment when we need its lesson most. And that moment comes for everyone, because we all eventually fall from whatever wall we've been sitting on, and we all discover that no amount of intervention, no gathering of forces, no desperation or love or stubbornness can put us back exactly as we were. That's not pessimism. It's just physics. It's just history. It's just the truth that Humpty Dumpty has been trying to teach us for over 300 years. Look at the wall you're sitting on. Feel how narrow it is. Notice how far down the ground seems, and understand that when you fall, and you will fall eventually because staying balanced forever is not an option granted to anyone, the king's horses and the king's men will do their best. But their best has limits. And sometimes, the break is permanent. Not as punishment, not as judgment, just as the natural conclusion of the physics of fragile things in a gravity-bound world. This is the mystery revealed. Humpty Dumpty was never really a mystery at all. It was always a warning, clear-eyed and unflinching, about the fragility we pretend not to see until it's too late to do anything but watch the pieces scatter and admit that, yes, this time, there's no putting it back together again.